Thus the reception of Tess by her fancied kinswoman terminated, and the birds were taken back to their quarters. The girl's surprise at Mrs. d'Urberville's manner was not great, for since seeing the size of the house she had expected no more. But she was far from being aware that the old lady had never heard a word of the so-called kinship. She gathered that no great affection flowed between the blind woman and her son. But in that, too, she was mistaken. Mrs. d'Urberville was not the first mother compelled to love her offspring resentfully and to be bitterly fond. In spite of the unpleasant irritation of the day before, Tess inclined to the freedom and novelty of her new position in the morning when the sun shone, now that she was once installed there, and she was curious to test her powers in the unexpected direction asked of her, so as to ascertain her chance of retaining her post. As soon as she was alone within the walled garden, she sat herself down on a coop, and seriously screwed up her mouth for the long-neglected practice. She found her former ability to have degenerated to the production of a hollow rush of wind through the lips, and no clear note at all. She remained fruitlessly blowing and blowing, wondering how she could have so grown out of the art which came by nature, till she became aware of a movement among the ivy boughs which cloaked the garden wall no less than the cottage. Looking that way, she beheld a form springing from the coping to the plot. It was Alec d'Urberville, whom she had not set eyes on since she had conducted her the day before to the door of the gardener's cottage, where she had lodgings. "Upon my word," cried he, "there never was before such a beautiful thing in nature or art as you. Look, cousin Tess." Cousin had a faint ring of mockery. "I have been watching you from over the wall, sitting like Impatience on a monument, and pouting up that pretty red mouth to whistling shape, and wooing and privately swearing, and never being able to produce a note. Why, you are quite cross because you can't do it." "I may be cross, but I didn't swear." "Ah, I understand why you're trying. Those bullies. My mother wants you to carry on their musical education. How selfish of her! As if attending to these cursed cocks and hens were not enough work for any girl. I would flatly refuse if I were you." "But she wants me particularly to do it, and to be ready by to-morrow morning." "Does she? Well, then, I'll give you a lesson or two." "Oh, no, you won't," said Tess, withdrawing towards the door. "Nonsense! I don't want to touch you. See, I'll stand on this side of the wire netting, and you can keep on the other side, so you may feel quite safe. Now, look here, you screw up your lips too harshly. There, 'tis so." He suited the action to the word, and whistled a line of "Take, oh take those lips away," but the illusion was lost upon Tess. "Now try," said d'Urberville. She attempted to look reserved. Her face put on a sculptural severity, but he persisted in his demand, and at last, to get rid of him, she did put up her lips as directed, for producing a clear note, laughing distressfully, however, and then blushing with vexation that she had laughed. He encouraged her with "Try again." Tess was quite serious, painfully serious by this time, and she tried, ultimately and unexpectedly emitting a real round sound. The momentary pleasure of success got the better of her. Her eyes enlarged, and she involuntarily smiled in his face. "That's it! Now I have started you. You'll go on beautifully. There, I said I would not come near you, and in spite of such temptation as never before fell to mortal man, I'll keep my word. Tess, do you think my mother a queer old soul?" "I don't know much of her yet, sir." "You'll find her so. She must be, to make you learn to whistle to her bullfinches. I'm rather out of her books just now, but you will be quite in favour if you treat her livestock well. Good morning. If you meet with any difficulties and want help here, don't go to the bailiff, come to me." It was in the economy of this regime that Tess Durbeyfield had undertaken to fill a place. Her first day's experiences were fairly typical of those which followed through many succeeding days. A familiarity with Alec d'Urberville's presence, which that young man carefully cultivated in her by playful dialogue and by jestingly calling her his cousin when they were alone, removed much of her original shyness of him, without, however, implanting any feeling which could engender shyness of a new and tenderer kind. But she was more pliable under his hands than a mere companionship would have made her, owing to her unavoidable dependence upon his mother, and through that lady's comparative helplessness upon him. She soon found that whistling to the bullfinches in Mrs. d'Urberville's room was no such onerous business when she had regained the art, for she had caught from her musical mother numerous airs that suited those songsters admirably. A far more satisfactory time than when she practised in the garden was this whistling by the cages each morning. Unrestrained by the young man's presence, she threw up her mouth, put her lips near the bars, and piped away in easeful grace to the attentive listeners. Mrs. d'Urberville slept in a large four-post bedstead, hung with heavy damask curtains, and the bullfinches occupied the same apartment, where they flitted about freely at certain hours, and made little white spots on the furniture and upholstery. Once, while Tess was at the window when the cages were ranged, giving her lesson as usual, she thought she heard a rustling behind the bed. The old lady was not present, and turning round, the girl had an impression that the toes of a pair of boots were visible below the fringe of the curtains. Thereupon her whistling became so disjointed that the listener, if such there were, must have discovered her suspicion of his presence. She searched the curtains every morning after that, but never found anybody within them. Alec d'Urberville had evidently thought better of his freak to terrify her by an ambush of that kind. End of chapter 9.